Happy to be here. I'm an environmental health scientist at the University of Maryland. Been there since 2011. Primarily do environmental justice research, so I'll talk about that during this discussion in my 15 minutes. And I'll also pepper in some of the other things that I'm doing. But we do a lot of engagement work in Maryland and around the DMV on environmental justice issues. So as Delegate Wells mentioned, talked about before, the history of this country, the environmental justice movement really started with Dr. King's work with the sanitation worker strike. He was assassinated 52 years ago, right, in Memphis. That was the intersection of class issues, race issues, labor issues, and health issues. And you see the man carrying the sign saying that I am a man. That's very relevant to our discussion today. He's saying, recognize my humanity, recognize our shared humanity, recognize what's happening in this country, the uprising against racism. As Melissa said, racism is baked into the walls, the fabric of this country, and it's baked into a lot of our policies, our housing policies, our food policies, criminal justice policies, our transportation policies. And so you have to really understand how structural racism plays a role in not just what you have access to, but what you're exposed to. But so Dr. King, in many ways, is the father of the EJ movement. And the environmental justice movement itself is a merger of the environmental movement and the civil rights movement. The movement got national attention with the fight against polychlorinated biphenyl landfill in Warren County, North Carolina. What's important to know is this is a primary Black community. This is a primary rural community focused on well water, and it was a low wealth community. So you see that intersection of race and class. So you become a target for these, what we call locally wanted land uses, right? We're talking about, these hazards and land uses include incinerators, landfills, chemical plants, refineries, concrete plants, paper mills, heavily trafficked roadways, any facility of use where you have pollution emissions. They tend to, for some reason, go into Black and brown communities, BIPOC communities. And so you think about the social movement, it's really fighting against this disproportionate burden of these facilities, of these uses, of these hazards in communities of color, in low-wealth communities, in communities that have been traditionally marginalized in this country. One thing I'd like to say real quickly about COVID-19, right? COVID-19 has made visible the populations that our policies have made invisible, right? You thinking in the state of Maryland, think about our agricultural workers, think about all our essential workers who disproportionately people of color, healthcare workers, right? Transit workers. Look at the workers in the meat processing plants, folks that are in nursing homes, who work there and who've been in those homes. So think about the vulnerable populations who've been disproportionately impacted, how the social determinants of health drive who gets infrastructure, who gets access, right? So those risk factors are really driving it's about context and place. You've heard that your zip code is more important than genetic code. So it's all about how context and place matters, right? Environmental justice is about where we live, where we work, where we play, where we pray, where we learn, right? So the various environments that we find ourselves in, right? The various built environments that we find ourselves in, but it's also connected to our social environment. It's connected to our economic environment. So as a social movement, the environmental justice movement is just not about the environment, it's an economic justice movement, right? It's a public health justice movement, okay? It's also political justice movement. So definition of environmental justice. I'm not gonna spend too much time on this slide because Delegate Hidalgo, I have way too many slides for 15 minutes. So make sure you keep me on time, okay? But this first definition is the EPA's definition, right? Fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people when it comes to the development and implementation of environmental rules, laws, and policies. Great definition, but we know because of racism has already been stated, in context and contemporary racism, historical contemporary, that's not happening, right? And so you look at the issues in Flint, Michigan, you saw the intersection of race, class, place, hazards, vulnerability, and visibility. It happens a lot across the country where if we really did have full enforcement of rules and regulations, you wouldn't have environmental justice, full enforcement of Clean Air Act, full protections from Clean Water Act, full protection of the Safe Drinking Water Act, okay? The second definition is Bunyan-Brown's definition. It talks about environmental justice can be achieved when we can experience our highest potential, right? So we think about potential, opportunity structures, okay? Think about just sustainability, just transit, just housing, just healthcare, just jobs, right? Just education. So you think about decent paying quality jobs, quality schools and recreation, decent housing, adequate healthcare. This definition is talking about the social determinants of health. Again, those drivers of access, of infrastructure, those drivers of opportunity. Communities are free of drugs, crime, and violence. So again, psychosocial stressors, okay? So I like this definition better because it's more holistic than that first definition. It speaks to, again, what we have access to, our infrastructure, our context, and the places that we live, where we work, where we play, where we pray, where we learn. Just a little bit more about that. The traditional framework of environmental justice, again, as I said before, it's the overburden of hazards. You have in the same community, you have a higher concentration of psychosocial stressors. And these same communities may have limited access to infrastructure. I like to use the term salutogenic infrastructure. That means health promoting infrastructure. So they may have less access to good food infrastructure. They have food injustice or food apartheid, more food swamps and food deserts. They have more liquor stores, more payday lenders, more quick loan facilities, right? They maybe having poor infrastructure, housing infrastructure, sewer backups in Baltimore, for example, right? They may have less access to natural amenities too, green space and parks, the tree canopy. That's important when you think about heat issues, right? So it's limited access to health promoting infrastructure, both built infrastructure and also natural infrastructure, built amenities, social amenities, and also natural amenities, clean rivers and streams, for example. Look at the Anacostia, look at the Patuxent River, Patapsco, right? The Chop Tank. So when you're overburdened by these hazards, particularly with the pollution sources, you may be exposed to chemical agents, right? So particulate matter, which I'll talk about later, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, those are byproducts when you combust fossil fuels, right? Also lead, right? Y'all think about lead and flint. When you have kids been exposed to lead, let's come back to Maryland, we're putting a cap on the potential of those kids, right? Because it's a neurocognitive toxicant. So we have to think about that. And then these exposures, these pollutants can lead to various disease outcomes, asthma, heart disease, cancer. But what's really important to note is just not the differential exposure to pollutants, it's also other agents you're exposed to, physical agents like noise pollution, right? And also biological agents, mold, mildew, dander, and in this case, it's pandemic, differential exposure to SARS-CoV-2 virus, okay? So these burden disparities lead to exposure disparities, lead to risk disparities, lead to health disparities, okay? And so we know that there's like a pollution gap. Whites experience a pollution advantage compared to people of color who experience a pollution burden. Studies have shown this. You have health disparities associated with air pollution. Communities of color, this gets back to redlining and segregation, right? Communities of color disproportionately host heavily trafficked roadways. So they've been disproportionately impacted by what we call traffic-related air pollution, particulate matter, organic compounds, nitrogen oxides, all these combustion byproducts. What do? They impact human health. So remember I said before, differential burden of highways lead to differential exposure to pollutants, lead to differential health outcomes. So think about that asthma disparities in our state. A lot is related to your exposure to air pollution, not just from stationary sources, but mobile pollution. And we have a lot of commuter traffic in our state. We also have a lot of industrial traffic because we have a lot of ongoing construction, okay? So, and then we talk about expanding, certain highways. Maybe we should be thinking about investing more in mass transit as a solution. So you won't have this differential burden on certain communities that we know about in the state of Maryland. And so you get to particulate matter. I want to say this real quickly. Particulate matter is dust in the air, 2.5 microns. That's diameter, right? Smaller than a strand of hair, right? Particulate matter can get into your lungs and damage your alveoli and your lung sacs. Particulate matter can cause asthma attacks. It can cause cancer. It can cause heart disease, contribute to diabetes, contribute to Alzheimer's, right? Increased birth defects. It leads to infant mortality, increased mortality. Also low birth worth babies, right? And it can lead to premature mortality and also impact life expectancy. So you have communities that have more pollution, particulate matter pollution. You can see differences in life expectancy depending upon your unit of analysis across census tracts, particularly across zip codes, right? And so, but what's egregious about PM is very efficient in delivering other toxicants into your body. So it can deliver metals like lead to your brain, to your kidney, to the liver. So you live in a community with a lot of air pollution, like particulate matter. It's just not the asthma, it's those other health effects associated with metals, whether it be mutating your DNA, whether it be impacting reproduction, whether it be impacting development. Okay, so these are the things that I think about with communities that are impacted by environmental injustice. It's the chemical mixtures and the multiple effects. So that's why we have to have better regulations and enforcement so we can reduce the pollution burden because it's impacting people across their life course, y'all. You can be exposed to pollution where you're pregnant. It impacts children, it impacts them across their life course. You can think about the health outcomes from exposed to pollutants as adults. And of course, if you're elderly, you're more at risk of premature death, having myocardial infarction because of living in a community with a lot of pollution. Okay, so that's why air pollution is a huge deal. And as Delegate Hidalgo mentioned, or maybe Delegate Wills mentioned, COVID-19. Air pollution is a major risk factor for COVID-19 disparities that we see, both morbidity, right, and also mortality. So we have to connect the dots. If you have environmental justice, you can have better air quality, better water quality, better infrastructure. So it's not just about the hazards, y'all. It's about our community ecosystems. Are we living in healthy community ecosystems and making sure that all the citizens of Maryland have access to healthy community ecosystems? Again, just sustainability, just transit, just housing, right? Just food infrastructure. Let me keep going. So examples of environmental injustice in the state of Maryland. You can think about urban heat islands, right? There's a history of redlining, and redline neighborhoods across the country tend to have more impervious surfaces, right? So that means you're gonna have more concrete, more asphalt. Those areas are gonna trap more heat, trap more greenhouse gases, right? You make those same areas that are redlined and have these heat issues, they may be places that have older housing stock too. And also those homes may have lack of air conditioning, right? Heat waves are hell for the poor and the elderly. I'm gonna get to Baltimore and some of that data. And in addition, these communities, because the impervious surfaces, they don't have what? They don't have trees, y'all. Trees are great. Trees are good for what? Noise pollution mitigation, air pollution mitigation, heat mitigation, right? Shade and cooling. Trees are good for playability. Trees are good for mental health. Trees are good for food. We should be investing in more urban agriculture in our areas that do not have access to food, because then you reduce the energy burden in those communities, but you also provide greater access to food. You can actually build new microeconomies. I'll get off that point, but I love talking about trees and food forests and urban ag. So think about the heat island effect in Baltimore, right? You can see increased temperatures in parts of Baltimore where you have more segregated neighborhoods. So segregation is, again, an indication of where you may have more heat islands and more heat stress. If you look at impervious surfaces versus temperature, look at the left map and the map on the right. The place we see more impervious surfaces, you're going to see higher temperatures in the place, because again, the albedo effect, that concrete and asphalt is absorbing, right? Keeping that heat and it's releasing it later at night. And that's the problem for folks who don't have air conditioning. Remember the heat wave a few years ago? The number of deaths that we saw, right? So we've had higher rates of heat-related deaths in older populations in Baltimore. And you can see extreme differences in heat and temperatures at the block level across blocks in Baltimore, because just of not having too much concrete and asphalt, and also the lack of tree canopy. And even on the same block, if a household has a tree, you can see a tremendous difference in the temperature for that row house compared to the next house, okay? Look at Curtis Bay. Some of you are familiar with some of the issues in Curtis Bay around the industrial facilities, right? The goods movement activities in Curtis Bay. All these major polluters, the Willebrator facility, the medical waste incinerator, right? The fight against the energy answers incinerator. Look at a lot of communities that are impacted by environmental justice, they have disparities when it comes to income. Look at the median household income for the Baybrook area compared to the rest of the state of Maryland. Also, these same communities, again, think about health disparities again. You see differences in mortality across communities, particularly those that have these pollution sources. Again, look at Curtis, the Baybrook area compared to the state of Maryland and to the US rates for various health outcomes, okay? This community that hosts the community Curtis Bay area, at one point in time, when it comes to the toxic release inventory, was the most toxic zip code in the country for air emissions. Again, a lot of air pollution in Black and brown communities in our state, okay? And so I'm gonna skip this slide, but you know about Destiny Warfare and their fight to stop the energy answers incinerator, but that's an important part of this discussion. Let's talk about rivers and streams. I mentioned a few before. The Anacostia, the Chop Tank, the Patuxent, Patapsco. The Anacostia River has a lot of pollution in the river. Stormwater inputs, trash. Think about all the plastic pollution in our state and how it impacts the rivers and also impacts the Chesapeake Bay. The toxicants from all the runoff of pesticides. Think about, again, we have a lot of traffic. So what goes up when you burn fossil fuels, y'all, what goes up must come down. So the deposition, whether it be atmospheric, dry, things fall out, or wet deposition, where's that stuff go? it runs off into our rivers and streams. It goes into our rivers and streams, okay? So you got folks on the Anacostia who are eating fish, right? So you got pollution sources along the Anacostia too, but you have people who are doing subsistence fishing. So we have legacy pollution sources along the Anacostia, where you have pollutants that get into the rivers and streams, and of course, fish, the lipid tissues. What do? Fatty tissues. What do? They absorb those toxins. So you got folks who are, for various reasons, who are still fishing on the Anacostia. That's an EJ issue. There are health risks associated with eating that contaminated fish. How am I doing on time, Delegate Hidalgo?
You're a little bit over.
Okay, let me hurry up. I'm sorry.
But it's so great. You're on a roll. I didn't want to stop you. Go for it.
Let me tighten up. I'm gonna get done. Give me 2 minutes.
You're doing great. Thank you.
Thank you. So Brandywine is unincorporated. Y'all, one of the things I've noticed in my work, unincorporated communities, they don't have a town mayor, don't have a town council. I call it contamination while representation. Brandywine has been, in many ways, this is what I believe, it's been used as a sacrifice zone for our county, Prince George County, but the state of Maryland, and also the DC region, because a lot of construction waste comes to Brandywine. A lot of fly ash waste goes to Brandywine. Why is that important? They have a Superfund site, they have a slush lagoon, they have those power plants, right? The coal-fired power plant and the gas-fired power plants being built. This is the thing, y'all. Natural gas is a euphemism. We should be, these communities that are overburdened by greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutants like particulate matter, NOx, et cetera, we should be investing in these communities. One of the ways that you address environmental justice is through investment. The reason why we have environmental injustice in many ways is because of inequities in planning, zoning, and development. Because of segregation and disinvestment and divestment. So if you're going to address those problems, you have to invest in these communities. So how can we invest in infrastructure, right? How can we invest in renewables, right? How can you invest in creating real jobs? Bringing in a pollution-intensive factory and bringing in a pipeline is not really economic development. Renewables are the way to go, because why? Because then you're not creating pollution, and then people are building the solar panels, folks are working at the factories, so you have a living wage job. At the same time, you reduce the negative impacts of the externalities that you see with pollution-intensive facilities on those communities. Communities that are hosting facilities, we're basically using them to absorb the externalities, the environmental externalities, and also the social externalities. So go back to that previous slide I talked about with the pregnant women. You're basically, if you live in a community with a lot of pollution, as a pregnant woman, you're absorbing that pollution. Those pollutants could be transferred to the developing fetus. When you breastfeed, if you live in a community where you're exposed to a lot of pollutants, you also are transferring that pollution through breast milk. If you live in a community and you were exposed to lead, for all of us, lead accumulates in our bones. So even if you leave that community as you age, that lead is re-released, right? For pregnant women, that lead is re-released during pregnancy. Okay, let me get done. But they also have a lot of industrial traffic in Brandywine area. So they have, as I already said, they have the power plants. And then what's really important about Brandywine, they also have a fly ash landfill. The only park in Brandywine is right beside the fly ash landfill. Fly ash contains arsenic, mercury, barium, beryllium, cadmium, chromium, radioactive isotopes, silica. That's a problem, y'all. Okay, so I'm gonna skip the Bladensburg example, get to my last couple slides. But so real quickly, we're doing a lot of work to develop tools to get into the hands of community members and also policymakers. So we developed tools that allow you to actually map environmental injustice in the state of Maryland. So this could be tools that can help you with your environmental decision-making. So we have a tool called EPA EJ Screen that's similar to US EPA EJ Screen. I can talk about that more later. And we also have a tool that's a park equity tool. Remember, a lot of our communities people of color communities do not have access to parks. There's one study that showed that folks in Baltimore have access to more parks, but have access to smaller parks compared to their white counterparts. So we have actually 3 tools that we're developing: Maryland EJ Screen tool, this park equity access mapping tool, and we also are developing a climate equity and health tool that community members, delegates can use for decision making. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Again, every time you speak, I learn more and more. So thank you so much for it. And I hated to cut you off.
No problem.
Dr. Wilson, if you could just drop some of your contact information in the chat. And maybe we'll see if we can make sure that gets on for everybody, because then people can reach out directly to you. The tool that you're developing that I've seen is absolutely amazing. So I did want to give a quick shout out to Delegate Criselda Valderrama, who is on the call. And I just wanted to say thank you for her organizing and help with the Asian American Pacific Islander Caucus. And then next to Dr. King, please.
Great, thank you. Let me see if I can get my slides up here. Great. So thanks, Delegate Fraser Hidalgo and Delegate Wells, for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. I appreciate folks making time to talk about this issue. And I want to build on Dr. Wilson's point to say that environmental justice, social justice, racial justice are all deeply interconnected. And what I want to focus on tonight is how all of those issues are related to education. Too often we talk about public policy issues in silos. And in fact, education is a place where we could be advancing environmental justice solutions, but too often the education sector has not been fully engaged on environmental justice and climate change issues. And similarly, the environmental justice movement and climate change movement haven't always seen schools as a central place to engage. So that's where I'm going to focus today. We can go to the next slide. Let's see, there we go. So we have roughly 100,000 schools in this country. Many of those schools are serving students who are directly impacted by the environmental injustice that Dr. Wilson talked about. All of those schools have their own carbon footprint. And the recent events around COVID have shown us how vulnerable our schools are to disruption and the need to build greater resilience. Next slide. We've got 50 million kids in America's schools, and there's an opportunity here through education to mobilize them in the work of environmental justice and addressing climate change. Next slide. Now, Dr. Wilson talked about the disparate impact of environmental hazards on low-income communities and communities of color. When we think specifically about kids of color and low-income kids, what we know is they are significantly more likely to live in homes and attend schools that are affected by all these environmental hazards. So schools serving low-income students and students of color are more likely to be located near pollution-generating activities. Their schools, often because of disparities in how we fund our schools, their schools often have less up-to-date maintenance, less up-to-date ventilation systems. That's one of the reasons why we see the disparate heat island effect in low-income schools and communities. Those schools are often ones where you're more likely to find lead in the pipes, asbestos, rodents, which then contributes to the kinds of air quality issues that lead to higher incidence of asthma. Also, we know that schools serving low-income students and students of color are often in places where there's less access to green space, both in the community and directly around the school. Next slide. So I'm working with a commission that was launched by the Aspen Institute called K-12 Climate Action, where our focus is really mobilizing the education sector on these issues. We can go to the next slide. I'm co-chairing that commission with former New Jersey Governor Christy Todd Whitman. So we're trying to make this a bipartisan effort. And we have a broad coalition of folks involved in that commission. You can go on to the next slide. Diverse group that includes the leaders of both teachers unions, the former governor of Delaware, the leaders of National Urban League and Unidos, folks from the Sierra Club, state superintendents, district superintendents, educators, young activists, including leaders in the Sunrise Movement. And that diverse coalition recently issued a report, a state policy landscape on education and climate change. And I want to share some of the key elements of that report because it points to specific actions we could be taking in Maryland to address environmental justice and the impact of climate change on our communities. Next slide. And that's a listing of the folks who are on the commission. Next slide. So we think about how we tackle these issues at the intersection of education and climate change and environmental justice in three ways. Mitigation, what we do to reduce the carbon footprint of our schools and school communities. Adaptation, how we respond to the changes that are already happening around climate change. We know we have extensive flooding here in the state. We know in California they're experiencing extreme wildfires in the south and southeast, hurricanes, and that's going to continue. And unless we take bold action to reduce the rate at which climate change is happening, all of this is going to get worse. There are projections that the climate of Maryland will look more like the climate of Mississippi if we don't take action to address climate change. And then there's a question of what we're doing inside of classrooms to help students be prepared to address these issues. Next slide. So on energy, we know that energy is the second largest expense in schools after staffing. And there are very concrete steps we can take to reduce carbon usage in schools. Think about schools having solar panels, think about changing their lighting systems so that they're responsive to daylight, think about changing heating systems, ventilation systems, but there are significant savings that could be realized for education if we could reduce energy use and move to renewable energy. But it requires upfront investment, and that is often the challenge. How do you finance that upfront investment? But certainly when we are investing in school facilities or facilities improvements, there's an opportunity to address some of these environmental issues. Next slide. Buses are a huge issue. There are 480,000 school buses in the country. We are spending billions of dollars per year on school buses. School buses are traveling upwards of 3 billion miles in a school year. And transportation is, in many places, our most significant driver of pollution, of greenhouse gas emission. And so what are we doing about our bus fleets? And what we ought to do is shift entirely to electric vehicles. That is achievable, it is possible. There are examples around the country of folks who are doing that work. One recent example in Virginia is a partnership with Dominion Energy, where they are subsidizing the shift to electric buses in exchange for being able to use the batteries on those buses for additional energy storage. Now, it's not to say that that's the perfect model, but there are ways to think about creatively financing the shift to an electric fleet that would reduce the carbon impact of schools, but it would also reduce directly air pollution in our communities that are most impacted by the environmental justice issues that Dr. Wilson described. Next slide. Food. We have more than 30 million kids each day when school is in regular session who are relying on school for the distribution of meals. How those meals are prepared, what happens with the waste from those meals is deeply tied to issues of environmental justice and climate change. Locally grown food is better. It is often healthier, but it's also better for the environment. It's better for the healthy ecosystems that Dr. Wilson was describing. but often we see very little usage of locally grown food in the preparation of school meals. States and communities can incentivize the use of locally grown food. I cite the example there of a program in Michigan where schools are reimbursed at a higher level when they use locally grown foods. Schools can have school gardens that are both a teaching tool and a way to produce food for the school. Surplus food and how it's used is a way that we can conserve. And of course, composting is an option for school communities. Next slide. Resilience. We have seen with the devastating impact of COVID on kids' educational experience, the consequences of not being resilient. We ought to have internet access and a device for every kid. We don't. When we saw in the spring, as a country, the amount of learning loss for kids who couldn't even log in to the classroom, we should have had a massive national response. Instead, the federal government failed us and left every school community on their own to sort this out. And so you had folks distributing hotspots, putting Wi-Fi on buses, but it was inadequate. And a survey that the Maryland State Department of Education did showed that we have many places in the state where less than 50% of students had reliable internet access. And even in the places that reported having higher rates of internet access, they were often relying on the idea that students would be able to access the internet through free public Wi-Fi rather than home internet. We also know there are kids still in the state who are doing their homework on their mom's cell phone because they don't have devices. This is a resilience problem. For COVID, it is also a resilience problem for school closures that might be caused by the environmental events that we can expect as a result of climate change. When schools are closed due to extreme weather events, we ought to have a way for students to continue to learn. We don't have that in place today. So this issue of resilience is critical. Next slide. What happens in the classroom can help shape students' readiness to grapple with these issues. Their lives will be affected by issues of environmental justice and climate change. So we should be thinking about this both in the context of science education, but also social studies education. I was a social studies teacher. I believe very strongly that schools should be preparing students to be good citizens, and all of our citizens are going to have to grapple with how we approach issues of environmental justice and climate change. So we have an opportunity to build students' environmental literacy. We have an opportunity to build their understanding of how we got here. The role, for example, as Dr. Wilson said, of redlining in the environmental injustice that we see. We have an opportunity to help students appreciate different ways of thinking about the relationship between people and their environment. Some of the traditions of indigenous peoples that prioritize healthy relationships to the environment. And there's also the role of outdoor education and exposing students, particularly those who live in places where there's limited green space, to the benefits of being in nature. And we know that that can make a positive academic difference for students. One example of a state that is thinking seriously about this is New Jersey, that just adopted a plan to have climate change standards across all content areas in their schools. Next slide. Career and technical education. We know that in 2019, the two fastest growing jobs were solar energy and working on wind turbines. So we have tremendous potential to grow green jobs, renewable energy jobs. We ought to be preparing young people for those. We have in the state some schools that are using Project Lead the Way. That's an example of teaching students about engineering and teaching them to apply those engineering skills to solving some of these environmental justice issues that we've been talking about. Next slide. So Delegate Fraser Hidalgo mentioned that I recently found an organization called Strong Future Maryland. This is an advocacy organization focused on progressive change in Maryland. And we want to advance equitable solutions to climate change that create good green jobs that are equitably available. But we know that to address climate change also means we need to tackle public transit, as Dr. Wilson said. More reliance on public transit will reduce our carbon footprint and reduce the air pollution that is experienced in many of our communities. More reliance on electric cars and moving more quickly to replace combustible engine automobiles will help us reduce air pollution, reduce our carbon footprint. We have to see that transportation, education, environmental justice, these are all deeply interconnected. Education funding. The schools that have the least resources are the ones that have the least ability to have good ventilation systems, up-to-date maintenance, and make the changes necessary to be more energy efficient. So at Strong Future Maryland, we want to be partners with all of you in the legislature to try to get these progressive changes done. I'll put in the chat our website information, but strongfuturemd.org. And you can follow us on Twitter at Future Maryland. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. King. Thank you, Dr. Wilson. So I had just a couple of quick questions and then we'll throw it out. I know that I think Cecia is going to try to help identify and start opening this up for all of our caucus members to start asking questions. I'd like it if they could ask the questions directly. So two pieces, I guess. Dr. Wilson, you talked about, I mean, basically, I guess to kind of sum it up, one of the things that you mentioned was that traditionally speaking, if you go back in history, whichever community, most of the time, obviously communities of color, from a socioeconomic perspective, end up, so the folks that have a lot of money end up taking what they don't want to look at or what they don't want to deal with, and they end up kind of dumping it in those communities of color because there's less ability for those communities to resist or organize or what have you. Is that pretty much what you said? And can you kind of expand upon that a little bit? And the reason I say that is because in our agenda, I always have, and both of you, we talked about connecting the dots, and I can't stress enough from my perspective, I think how important it is to see how all of this is from education and all of it is connected.
No, thank you for that. No, I think that's a really important question. So you're talking about, how your economic power equates to political power. As Delegate Wells mentioned, look, she just talked about the history of racism in this country. Think about the wealth gap. As Dr. King mentioned, you think about the history of FHA, HOLC, GI Bill, who got the loans and redlining. The wealth gap, home ownership equates to wealth in this country. So every $100 that a white resident has, Black folks is $10, right? So that's the stat. So think about your economic power. If you have limited economic power, that it impacts political power. So folks that have more economic power are able to say, no, do not bring that into my community. So we talk about not in my backyard. Dr. Robert Bullard, who's an EJ icon, he calls it PIBBY. So you go from NIBBY to PIBBY. PIBBY is put in Blacks' backyards. So time and time again, you see it put, and just multiple studies. So this is just not conjecture, y'all, or speculation, or me just saying, being very passionate about it. We have data, we have stats that show this, and also part of the driver behind that. If you think about that income inequality, that wealth gap, a lot of these facilities are seen as economic development. But I like to push back on that. Why are we keep bringing these type of infrastructures to communities of color? Why can't they deserve better? So to me, you think about economic development, you can have safe jobs, green jobs, without bringing pollution intensive facilities into communities of color. Because what happens in many cases, when you think about the waste streams, for example, if you think about landfill or an incinerator, that money may go into the coffers of that county or that jurisdiction. But in many cases, those resources do not trickle back down to the folks hosting that hazard or land use, right? So that's what environmental injustice ends up being about, differential burden and differential benefits. So if you think about the overall county or jurisdiction, yes, it may be beneficial as it relates to the coffers, but the folks who are proximal, who host it, they really don't any economic, social, health benefits with the accrue are the social and health externalities. Time again. Yes.
That is great. And so actually you started answering my second question, and then I'm going to open it up. But my second question, and you started talking about it with the idea that there's almost a false choice, right? So there's economic development, but these economic development are often jobs that aren't, they're presented as these great jobs that are going to uplift communities, but the concern really is, are they really going to uplift these communities, and or what do the communities look like during and after those jobs, especially if those jobs aren't, if they're infrastructure jobs. So the question that I had was, when we hear terms from the fossil fuel industry like clean diesel or clean coal or clean natural gas, what does that really mean? And Dr. King, you feel free to jump in as well. But I'd like to know what your thoughts are, and what is that code for, or what does that really mean when they use those terms?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. So when you use those are euphemisms. There's no such thing as clean diesel, clean coal. Because remember, when you burn it, you still get combustion byproducts, folks. Okay, so from the particular matter I mentioned to nitrogen oxides, just remember it. You can say NOx, you knock on the door, if you remember NOx, and then SOx, you pull your socks up. So NOx and SOx is just a corny way for folks to remember some of the pollutants, right? But they have adverse health effects, right? You have the PAHs. When you have an incinerator, for example, you're burning trash, it creates furans and other pollutants that impact human health. But the issue is, think about the whole process, right? So you're building a facility, those construction jobs, short-term construction jobs. Those are people who are in a union or a trade jobs. They are certified, they are trained. Most of the local residents may not have the training even to build it, right? And then those jobs go away. So most of these facilities are highly mechanized and highly automated. There's not a lot of long-term permanent jobs. The long-term permanent jobs tend to be for people, again, who do not live in the community. So any of the resources when it comes to that paycheck, those paychecks do not stay in that local community. Those paychecks, those dollars go out, are outside those communities, right? So when you have a fossil fuel industry talking about a power plant, a coal fire, a gas fire plant, those plants, you have to do a true cost accounting, again, of the negative impacts and the positive benefits. That local community, in many cases, are not accruing any real economic, health, environmental, or social benefits. And then you would think about the negative impacts for the large community. You got to think about the greenhouse gas emissions, which could contribute to climate change, but also, again, those co-pollutants. So we never do a true cost accounting. It's like, okay, we're gonna bring in jobs, right? But you're not doing a true cost accounting of what the real impacts, negative impacts, and the positive impacts. And I would say every time, if you did a true cost accounting, you will always come on the wrong end of it if you're talking about gas or coal. Okay, I'll stop there. Go ahead, Dr. King.
Well, just a quick point, just to say, I mean, I think we've been reminded this week of how important it is to help folks develop the skills to be critical consumers of media and messages that they're receiving. And, you know, when you hear something like clean coal, that's propaganda. And so we have to prepare our students. And this is part of why I say this is a social studies topic, not just a science topic. We have to prepare students to be able to distinguish between fact and fiction, to analyze what is the motive behind the author of a particular piece of information, so that they're prepared to cut through some of this propaganda that's being spread.
So on the propaganda, and then this is the last one. I know Delegate Wells, you're next. So it's challenging when the industry talks, when they put the word clean in front of it, because it is propaganda, right? So if you say clean coal, no, what about when you say like clean natural gas? So now you have two of the three words that make it sound so wonderful. And I don't know if you want to briefly, Dr. King, if you want to briefly say something about that, or Dr. Wilson, either one.
Go ahead, Dr. King.
Well, I'll let Dr. Wilson talk about the science. I mean, what I would say from a policy perspective is, to me, it's part of a political strategy to try to avoid the reckoning we need to have with the role of fossil fuels in our society. I mean, the reality is, and I think Dr. Wilson has underscored this, the fossil fuel industry is built on environmental racism. If you didn't put the facilities in places that spewed their pollution onto people of color, the facilities wouldn't get built, right? So at the end of the day, we have to be on a glide path to the end of the fossil fuel industry, and the fossil fuel companies know it. They're putting their investment into renewables because that has to be our future, and we need to get there as quickly as possible.
And I'll try to be say really quickly. I won't talk too fast. But as Dr. King mentioned, you have to think about the life cycle. Extraction, fracking, disproportionate impacts folks of color and low wealth populations, right? Traditional oil and gas, right? Look at NAACP reports. They have 2 reports about this: fumes across the fence line and cold-blooded, where they talk about the disproportionate impacts of the fossil fuel industry on communities of color. Then you get transport, right? Pipelines and compressor stations. Who is impacted? Disproportionately low wealth folks, right? You got folks of color. You got ethane crackers now in issue in Ohio and Pennsylvania, right? You got the LNG facility in Cove Point. Now you have more racial heterogeneity in that area, more white folks, right, in the Cove Point area. But there's a lot of low wealth folks who are impacted, right? The pipelines issues. You have the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, these and other pipelines. So you're connecting these pipelines to these facilities that are shipping gas to other parts of the world, right? Whose impact along the whole life cycle? Then you got the processing of fossil fuels, right? You got the refineries. Think about the Gulf Coast. We have a lot of refineries. California, Richmond, California, a lot of refineries. This will impact the communities of color and low wealth folks. Then you got the creation of products like plastic. Plastic pollution, again, disproportionately impacts folks of color. I mean, think about the single-use plastics, fast food restaurants. Where are they at, right? You got to connect the dots again. And then think about the waste products. You have the leftover waste. Where the plastics are going? Landfills. Whose communities disproportionately host landfills? Whose communities disproportionately host incinerators? Look at the Willowbrae incinerator, that whole fight in Baltimore. So again, the whole life cycle, this has been dumped on folks of color across the life cycle, and they deserve better. I'll stop there.
Delegate Wells, I would really like to see you follow that.
No, actually, I'm gonna give it a little bit, but it's still very much related. But I think, at least I'll say, for a lot of conversations I have with my constituents, I think sometimes the elephant in the room is that a lot of who is leading the environmental movement does not look like the folks represented on this call. And so I think that the biggest challenge I'm facing is, how can we really lead with environmental justice as our equity framework, right? So I'm thinking, like, we obviously have to transition away from fossil fuels. I don't, well, there's people that deny that, but I'm not one of them. But I think the other thing is, I think about, Baltimore and our Title VI complaint with the Red Line, right? Yep. And transportation access, and, and I think about that there's folks in the environmental movement that are NIMBYists, right? And so I think sometimes a challenge, even with, regard to what we talked about, lead exposure and access to quality housing. I know Delegate Hintz is on the call. She does a lot of work around the quality around, mold and lead exposure. And so I think the challenge that a lot of my constituents, a lot of low-income constituents also have, is that the conversation around the environment doesn't have the same fervor from other allies around transportation, in terms of really pushing for transportation investments, right? There's a lot of talking about it, or with regard to housing and holding substandard landlords accountable. And so I would love to hear what your suggestions are around how we can lead with that environmental justice as our equity framework. If there's any examples of legislation in other states or jurisdictions across this country that we can begin to look to, because if we have a clean renewable energy plan that still is baked with racism and structural racism, which is, then we're not really, you're using the pain and the suffering, but you're not helping change that pain and suffering into all of these amazing things that you say closing incinerator will do.
Yeah. No, thank you. It's really, really important question. And this is an important discussion that we need to have. This is not the only time we should have this discussion. It should be an ongoing discussion. Since I've been here at University of Maryland since 2011, and what I recognized was, the infrastructure when it comes to community-based organizations who use the EJ frame. There are not a lot of CBOs who use the environmental justice framework in this state, right? So that grassroots infrastructure, partly because lack of limited capacity cases, right? So your funders, your big funders in this state, they haven't been funding environmental justice. They haven't been funding these community groups. They've been saying it's mission creep. That's not what we do. They've been primarily funding conservation of the Bay. You can't talk about conserving the Bay without conserving the people. You have to connect the two together. So I think the culture of the environmental industrial complex, I'm gonna use that frame. I'm including the green groups and also the advocacy groups and also the funders. They traditionally have not addressed these issues. The EJ is proximal, y'all. EJ is everyday. EJ is pocketbook. You gotta be talking about food, family, health, and jobs. Food, faith, family, health, and jobs, right? And so they haven't been doing that. They've been talking more about ecological issues, which is important, but not connecting back to people. So we have to change the environmental industrial complex. That's one part of it. We got to make sure that we're funding EJ groups. That's another part of it. And as it relates to the structural barriers when it comes to access of constituents, when it comes to coming to Annapolis, you know, that's a huge issue too. So the folks that are active, engaged, how can their voices provide testimony on various bills? Now, when it gets to bills, let me be quiet, I put some stuff in the chat. There are a number of templates that are out there, best practice, best models. S233 in New Jersey, the Cumulative Impacts Bill, SB 1000 in California was passed a few years back that said every county in California has to have an EJ plan and an EJ and a comprehensive plan. Thing to do. That brings in equity in every county, right? You also have SB 617, 619 that was passed a few years back for community-based air quality monitoring. The problem is a lot of communities have a lot of air quality, but our regulatory monitoring network is not capturing the pollution. I'm gonna be provocative. Because there's so many permits of these hazardous facilities and communities of color, I call it state-sanctioned poisoning. Allowing facilities to pollute. That's what we need renewables. There should be no emissions. There should be no externalities. That should be the frame. Why is it the opposite, y'all? Like you're allowed to pollute. You shouldn't be allowed to pollute. So I'm saying, that's something to think about. But how can we do that? There's also been Chicago. They have green roofs and green zones. Take your resiliency hubs in Baltimore and bring more equity in that and make that more of a statewide model. I mean, I think there's multiple examples from Virginia, passed a new EJ legislation, North Carolina, executive order on environmental justice. We got more stuff from New Jersey. There are a lot of examples out there that we can bring to the state, but I think first we have to change the culture and the infrastructure, the ecosystem that makes sure community folk who are impacted can be funded, they can share their stories and impact legislation in Annapolis. And I'll stop.
Dr. King?
I mean, this is exactly the kind of coalition building we want to do at Strong Future Maryland. Too often, the groups that are focused on climate change and those issues are not necessarily talking to or engaged with the communities that are affected by the environmental justice issues that Dr. Wilson is describing. And as a result, you have folks missing the opportunity to push for solutions that are intersectional. And so we've got to think about how do we do that coalition building here in Maryland in a way that gets folks who are environmental justice advocates in Montgomery County as mad about the governor's misguided decision to cancel the red line as folks in Baltimore City.
Right. And just to follow up real quick, nationally, Delegate Wills, the EJ for All Act, that's a model. The infrastructure bill that passed in the House but didn't pass in the Senate. We need infrastructure investments. That's really, really important. Then also in the state, and I put in the chat, why do we have an environmental justice commission and a climate change commission? We only have one commission. It's all connected.
His camera's down, but
His phone, probably.
Right. And so and then the climate change commission gets more funding, it's better staff. So that means you prioritize climate change over environmental justice, but you can't have climate justice without environmental justice. And I'll stop there.
Right, and something you mentioned, Dr. Wilson, that I thought was very interesting, and you kind of round it out, I guess, a little bit, like you need a certain amount of electricity, period, right, to run the state. So you have a choice as to how you generate that electricity. You can generate that electricity via solar, you can generate that electricity via wind, you can generate it by burning fossil fuels. There's a lot of ways you can generate it. But whenever you make a decision not to generate it via renewables, then often, maybe not in every single situation, but more often than not, the decision you're making is to burn fossil fuels in communities of color. When you decide you do not want to, and you're going to do everything you can to postpone wind turbines going out on the Eastern Shore or off the coast of Ocean City because people don't want to look at it, every single time you delay that, you are polluting communities of color more and more and more. Is that fair to say?
And that's environmental racism. Let's call it what it is, y'all. That's environmental racism. So when you're making those decisions, you're basically externalizing that to communities of color. And it's the same communities that we're talking about who, like I said with Curtis Bay, you saw the poverty, you saw the income rate, you saw the health disparities. That's what happens when these communities get dumped on and become sacrifice zones. So we have to really think about health. How are we going to improve health so through this social justice equity lens? And I think, you know, that has to be the core of what we do. And I want to say one more quick thing. I put in the chat, Dr. King did a great job talking about electrification. Let's think about electrification as a health intervention, a bill. Electrification, health is not just being disease-free, y'all. Healthy communities, quality of life, healthy jobs, healthy ecosystems, right? Electrification could be a real key. Investing in that could solve pollution problems, jobs problems, resources for our kids, as Dr. King mentioned. That's the innovation that we need in legislation in the state of Maryland.
Great. Okay, let's go to questions. I know the first question that we had was from Senator Arthur Ellis. Is he on? Senator Ellis?
I
Nope.
don't think he's on, unfortunately.
Okay. The next question would be to Benjamin Alexandro. Cecia should be unmuting you. We've had a little bit of problems with some of the video, but Benjamin, can you speak?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead. You're on.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, my question was, are there any specific legislations or bills that are coming up in the next legislative session that you would recommend could really use some help and support from, you know, from those green organizations that you had mentioned and also from the larger public as a whole? Are there any specific ones that you see that there might be the greatest need there?
I will say real quickly that Delegate Fraser Hidalgo's carbon pricing bill, I think is an opportunity for us to integrate some of these concepts around equity and justice in that. I will also think that Delegate Charkoudian's, I think she's submitting like an energy, was it energy bill? Maybe an energy bill that may be another place where think about renewables as renewables access as a social justice intervention. Think about that, y'all. I mean, that's what we're talking about, okay? And then I think there's some discussions about the Green Amendment, and that bill may be an opportunity. I think for me, Ben, and this gets back to Dr. King's point, and this is some work that we've been talking about. We have to have, and this is for you also, Delegate Wells, we have to have a strategy, like a 5-tier plan, right? And how are we going to bring environmental justice to the forefront, integrate the legislation, and think about what are the issues and what are the opportunities, right? What are the issues and the opportunities when it comes to bills? So we have a current suite of bills, but what are those things that are missing? What needs to be tweaked? What needs to be expanded? And I'll say this one last thing. We, as Delegate Fraser Hidalgo mentioned, you don't have to think about environment and jobs separately. It's not like if you do one, you can't have the other, you know. So a green futures bill that brings in these pieces together too. Renewables, jobs, economic opportunity structures. I'm not sure that's on the slate now, Ben, but that's something I would like to see delegates pull together, because that would be very positive for a lot of the communities that we're talking about.
And I'd just add to that, I think the carbon pricing bill has the potential to both generate revenue that could be helpful in paying for Kerwin and the work that we need to do through the blueprint to improve education equity, and provide funding that can be used to more quickly transition to renewable energy throughout the state, and subsidize low and moderate income folks so that they don't feel as much of the impact of the carbon pricing in terms of their energy bills. So that bill has the benefit of tackling environmental issues and education simultaneously. I'd also say there's some implementation opportunities around the blueprint and the school construction funding, right? The school construction funding ought to be implemented in a way that makes our schools more likely to use renewable energy, that makes our schools places that have green space, right? We can be intentional about the implementation there. And similarly, as we think about the blueprint components on career and technical education, we ought to be training more young people for the green jobs of the future. I put in the chat this Nobel Prize winning economist who makes the argument that we could create 25 million jobs through a electrification strategy. So we ought to be thinking about the future workforce of the state in terms of renewables.
And just to add to what Dr. K mentioned, like the carbon pricing, very similar to what California has with their climate fund, but they got that through carbon trading. We're not trying to do carbon trading. Carbon price is a fair way to get to building that fund out. So there's something called the climate gap report that y'all can review. But there are a number of bills that have come out of California related to climate change where they are tapping into the climate fund for implementation. Okay.
Great. Okay, so just to kind of get it out there, next we have in order Delegate Proctor, then Delegate Solomon, and then Cindy Ostro. So Delegate Proctor, please.
I believe she had to jump off, unfortunately. So we can move to Delegate Solomon.
Yeah, Delegate Solomon, please, you're up.
Thank you, Delegate Fraser Hidalgo and Delegate Wells and Delegate Valderrama for pulling this amazing panel together. Dr. King, it's always good to hear you, and Dr. Wilson, thanks for being here. It's sort of a two-part question for one part for each of you. So, Dr. Wilson, I'd be curious to sort of hear your opinion on, how we effectively push back on, this idea that natural gas is, I think you've mentioned it a little bit, but I think we get into this system where everybody says, natural gas is a bridge fuel and that's what we need to do. And, we continually see us losing out on other renewable projects because natural gas is just easier. And then Dr. King, I love what you're saying about particularly making our schools greener. I have a piece of legislation that I think last year probably would have passed without COVID, around just even getting schools to update their energy policies and, starting to think more about how we increase the number of net zero schools. We've got 3 of them in Maryland. And would love your take on, we always get this pushback that we barely have enough school construction money as it is, to get anywhere near the level of need that we have. And so if we're doing all of these things that cost more on the front end, that's less that we can actually fix. And that's, I think, a constant source of frustration that many of us who are working on this run into, and would love your take on that.
I'll jump in real quick. I think the pipeline issue is really important. Gases is really important. I mean, I think we made progress with the banning fracking, but I like to joke in a way. I was part of a team that did the study on the public health impacts of fracking in Maryland, and I think that was probably helpful in banning fracking. But we didn't ban frack gas, which I don't understand how that happened right in that ban. So I think we have to. It gets this back to the narrative, right? And it's a narrative actually in some ways that green groups have also supported. And it speaks back to Delegate Wells' point about the wrong voices creating the narrative, right? Because if you have folks who are like impacted by these pipelines and by the compressor stations, right? You got to push that gas, and you have a totally different narrative, right? But we got folks in many cases who are not living by the pipeline, who are not impacted by pipelines, and are basically pushing legislation. So we have a mismatch between the people who are impacted and the people who are pushing and making the legislation happen. That's a problem. And we have a structural problem, right? So I think we have to really get to, again, true cost accounting of gas and what it means, pipelines. And we haven't been doing that. And we need to sell that narrative and have that data, that evidence, and have the folks who are impacted by it, whether it be in our state and other states, saying, this is not a good choice for us. And why renewables, true cost accounting, what do you get? The jobs you get, the health benefits you get, the reductions in the improvements in air quality, the reductions in asthma hospitalizations. That's how we need to tell the stories. And then that's how we can get the bills passed. But I think that's the data that's missing, and those narratives of those most impacted have been missing. And again, just to sum it up, our green groups have not done the best job. I'm not gonna call anybody specifically out who may be on the call, but even supporting dirty fossil fuels as part of the renewable performance standards, the RPS. Some green groups did that. That's just not good, because they're not the folks who are most impacted by those bad decisions. Folks who live by the incinerator are suffering from that kind of bad decision. So I'll stop there.
It's a great point. I appreciate Delegate Solomon you leading on the issue of green schools. And I guess the way I would think about it is the truth of what we need to do about climate change to avoid catastrophic damage to our health, well-being, and economy is we ought to be thinking about how we rapidly retrofit all of our existing buildings. But to do any kind of new construction in a way that isn't green makes no sense given the urgency of the crisis. So I think there's some public education work we have to do around the urgency here. And we also need to help folks understand that in the long run, if we do new construction in ways and retrofitting in ways that are energy efficient, we will realize savings later. And to my mind, part of the role of the government is to try to take the long view and be in a position to put in a little more upfront early to realize those long-term savings, not to mention the long-term health and justice benefits that Dr. Wilson just described. So I appreciate your leadership on this and hope that we can be helpful in making the public case around this.
Thanks to both of you.
Thank you, Delegate Solomon. Was that it? Did you have anything else, Delegate?
Nope, that was it. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next, we have Cindy Ostro. Did I pronounce that properly, Cindy?
Hello, Cindy Osordo.
Thank you.
I'm actually with the Maryland Department of the Environment, and I help Laura Collard with the Maryland Association of Environmental and Outdoor Education also made a comment in the chat that there's a Maryland Green Schools program that is doing amazing work. I was wondering for Dr. King, what type of social studies I studied economics, so I have a bias. I think social studies is very important in climate change discussions. So I was wondering what type of topics you would ideally like to see in climate change requirements in schools.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to see us tackle, to your point about economics, to help students understand the economics of climate change, how we got here, and what we need to do to go forward from here. I'd love to see connections to sociology and some of the issues of racial justice that Dr. Wilson talked about. To understand how we got where we are, you have to understand the history of how lands were taken from indigenous people in order to serve the fossil fuel industry. You have to understand the history of industrialization in the country and globally. You have to understand the choices we've made about where pollution is directed and the racial dynamics of that. As Dr. Wilson talked about, the role that redlining has played in who lives in places that are most affected by environmental injustice. You could also tackle with students some of the statistics work that ought to be a part of citizenship, right? Understanding, why is it that Maryland is I think an MIT study showed that Maryland is the leading state in fatalities related to air pollution. Why is that? Why is it that asthma hospitalization rates are dramatically higher in Baltimore City than in the rest of the state and nationally, right? So there's an opportunity, I think, to get students to see climate change from multiple dimensions and environmental justice from multiple dimensions. obviously a lot of work you could do in high school around that, but you need to start building understanding of these concepts in middle school and elementary school as well. And then giving students a sense of who's making these decisions. How do students affect change in their communities? And one of the things that's inspiring actually about these issues of environmental justice is folks like Sunrise and young people who are actually demanding change. I wish more school districts had young people showing up at school board meetings demanding that school districts change their policies on these issues. It happens in some places, but we ought to see that in every school district.
Great. That strikes me as something that I've mentioned to both you, Dr. King and Dr. Wilson. When we're talking about our youth learning and growing up, I think that there's going to be a whole generation of folks that come up behind us, and they look at us and they ask us this question, and this question, it goes something along the lines of this. So let me get this straight. Your generation thought it was a really good idea to run pipes into people's houses and in their apartment buildings, fill it with a flammable gas that you can't smell, you can't taste, you can't hear, and then occasionally, on a kind of normal basis, these houses or these apartment buildings explode and kill a lot of people and blow up entire city blocks. And you were wondering how that happened. You thought that was a really good idea. Like, what was your generation thinking? That's what I think the next generations are going to ask. With that said, our next question is Anthony Field. Anthony, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank
so
you
much,
very
Anthony.
much for hosting this. Thank you very much, Dr. Kane and Dr. Wilson. I really appreciate everything that you said. I think this has been touched on a few times, but I'm curious if either of you have an opinion specifically on the proposed Eastern Shore pipelines. And I think what Delegate Hidalgo just mentioned was a great segue into that. These pipelines would feed into Somerset and Macomb counties. One of the end users would be UMES and HBCU. And recently there was a study released that found that 40 of the census tracts that the pipeline would be constructed through were environmental justice areas, meaning they were over 30% people of color or over 20% in poverty in those communities. And I'm curious if you have any direct thoughts on that, or just in general, the routine construction of fossil fuel infrastructure through those communities.
Yeah, I'll go. Go ahead, Dr. Go ahead,
No,
Dr.
I was just going to say, maybe this is glib, but the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. I mean, it just makes no sense to approach energy in this way. Dr. Wilson, you'll say something more, less glib.
No, I mean, you know the patterns, right? We've seen the data, again, the life cycle. So the fact that this is happening is not, surprising, but it's unfortunate because we have so much, we made a lot of progress in the state. We have a lot of opportunity in the state. And I understand there's a socioeconomic rationale, if you think about another point of view, for it, because that county isn't that the county the poorest county in the state of Maryland? But that doesn't mean that we give them a pipeline. That's the problem. We have to invest in better infrastructure for our economically under-resourced areas. So I think, because what it does then, you're exacerbating or creating a new sacrifice zone. Now, as a HBCU grad myself, I understand, that potential benefits of this for the HBCU, Eastern Shore, but I think they were leading in some ways in some other areas as it relates to being a green institution, but this is greenwashing. That's what this is. And so I think we have to do a better job of understanding what the needs are, what the choices are, and again, having true cost accounting of what are the, doing a cost benefit analysis, true cost accounting, to understand what are all the negative social, environmental, health, and economic impacts, and what are the benefits. And I say time and time again, if you did that right, you would never put in the pipeline. You would invest in solar, you would invest in wind, you would invest in geothermal. Time and time again, if you did that.
Just one quick note on the opportunity, as we think about overriding the governor's veto essentially of the HBCU funding, or rather redoing the bill to ensure HBCU funding. One question could be, why not at a place like UMES invest in the development of a center of excellence for renewable energies? Why not prepare young people who are going to work in solar and wind, right? Like we should be thinking about every initiative. How can this initiative be shaped in a way that can contribute to environmental justice?
And let me add to that real quick. I'm gonna be a little bit more provocative. It's a form of reparations, y'all. I'm sorry. You got too many communities that have been dumped on sacrifice zones. So how can we restore those communities? So you're exactly right. That is a way to, you're focusing on diverse communities that have been underserved. A lot of these youth students who go to those HBCUs, they're coming from these communities that we're talking about, okay? And so you're investing in the future. Remember I said, this, you're doing workforce development. You're creating a new economic opportunity structure. So environmental justice part of this is restoring, repairing. We need to restore and repair the damage that we've done to these communities. In a similar way, I think South Carolina State of Claflin in South Carolina, it has I think a center of excellence for transportation. Now there's probably some bad stuff with that, right? But that's the kind of thing we need to bring to our HBCUs. So how can we be doing, Coppin has been doing some stuff around climate change. We got climate change work been done by Dr. Mark Barnes at Morgan State. You got Bowie State. You got folks who are interested in green jobs and green infrastructure. So we should exactly do what you're saying, have a bill that focuses on HBCUs and funding them to be these centers of excellence, these demonstration sites, these economic drivers of our future economy.
Very well said. Delegate Charkoudian, I think, is next.
Great, thank you. Thank you to the caucuses that put this together, and Dr. King, Dr. Wilson, always a pleasure to hear from both of you. I wanted to follow up on Dr. Wilson, some of what you started to say about some of the bills that I'm working on. I think I want to highlight and ask you to comment on this idea that within every within every piece of legislation related to the environment, there's an opportunity to highlight front and center environmental justice. And I just want to give two examples of that. So one is a number of years ago when we set the Empower program in the state, we set a really bold standard of 2% energy efficiency gains across the state. And we've done really well with that. And it's a national model. So that's the good news. The shameful news within that is that when you break out low income energy efficiency gains, 2 years ago, the improvement was, compared to the 2% for the whole state, the improvement was 0.04%. So now you have the folks who are the most energy burdened, need the assistance in terms of decreasing their energy burden, are already burdened with environmental injustices in their community, have indoor air quality issues, outdoor air quality issues, are the people who are gaining the least from this program that everybody is paying into. So they're essentially now subsidizing wealthier folks to get these improvements. And so I do have a bill, I'll just be shameless in promoting it right now, that establishes standards for low income energy efficiency gains and moves more money around, and actually moves money out of the natural gas expansion fund and into, believe it or not, we have one, and into improvements in low-income energy efficiency, but then also ties together indoor air quality. And this, I think, gets to some of Delegate Wells' points, the indoor air quality, the mold, the lead, and all of those things that we can be doing at the same time as we're improving the environmental the environmental impact in terms of energy efficiency. And I think that we have this opportunity to do this in every single piece of legislation. I think we have to look at our Forest Conservation Act in the same way. Right now, I've got the purple line coming through my district, which I have to say I'm thrilled that it's coming. But what's happened is big mature trees have been taken down on University Boulevard, which is an environmental justice community. They've been replaced 2 hours away. So you have the heat island, and that's consistent with the Forest Conservation Act. The heat island effect on University Boulevard, the trees are being replaced net gain for the planet, but elsewhere. And I think you could look at environmental protection legislation, one piece after another, and you see this kind of net impact. But when you drill down, it reinforces the injustice. And so I'll stop there, but I guess I just would want you to comment on that. And I would ask and challenge and want to work with my colleagues who are on this call to really look at every single piece from that perspective of how do we make sure that any time we're making an improvement from an environmental perspective, we are, and you talked about reparations, we're highlighting and doubly investing in the communities as opposed to what seems to be happening now, which is they end up being the communities that pay more for the benefits that go to the entire state.
No, I think that's really important. I think what we have to do, and what I suggest and implore delegates to do, is have a equity and justice lens when we look at all these bills. And again, going back to the language I used before about what are the benefits and who's accruing those benefits, and how the rate of accrual, right, and based on the need. So the rate of accrual should be adjusted based on the need. So if the area has low need, then they shouldn't be accruing at a higher rate to the area that has more need. I mean, I'm not the economist because I did all right, but there needs to be some of that brought into how, again, this whole true cost accounting. So that equity and justice lens will allow you to kind of look at that and make sure that even if everybody's benefiting, maybe we should need to have increased benefits to this area because of the increased disadvantage, that pollution disadvantage that they were dealing with in advance, right? How can you address the pollution disadvantage? And not saying that we want to have equity, everybody gets the same level of pollution. I'm not saying that. But I want to say, how can we make sure that the folks who have been pollution disadvantaged get more of the benefits and get more of the investments that will lead to an ROI in those 4 B's I keep emphasizing during this discussion: economic, social, environmental, health benefits. Okay, I'll stop there. But I think you're exactly right. Across the bills, equity and justice lens, and then equity and justice language integrated into all these bills.
That's right. They're so grateful for your leadership on this, Delegate Charkoudian. And I would just say because of the history, right, if we aren't actively including environmental justice in each step forward, then we are just gonna build on top of the existing inequities. The only way we get to a better place is if we are dismantling the consequences of environmental racism with each step that we take forward.
Yeah, it seems like a common thread that both of you have said. It's the total cost of ownership, right? I mean, like, for example, electric vehicles, they cost a little bit more than internal combustion engine vehicles, but when you take into consideration the total cost, they're far cheaper. And this applies to all of these as well. I think that's it for the questions. Cecia, did I miss anybody? Do we have any other questions?
Nope, that's everything.
That's everything. So I'd like to close by first thanking Cecia for helping to put all this together. Thank you, Cecia. You are amazing. You are wonderful as always. Thank you so much, Cecia Fuentes. I'd like to thank my partner, Delegate Wells and Delegate Valderrama, for helping to organize our caucuses to put this together. And lastly, and most importantly, I would like to thank our 2 main speakers, both Dr. King and Dr. Wilson. You both of you are amazing, and you're able to put in light what has been so long in the dark, and you're able to really kind of make this so people can really wrap their heads around it. This is such a complicated issue, and I think this is our 101. I have talked with Delegate Wells, and we'll talk in the future, and Delegate Valderrama as well, about maybe doing a 102 or a 103 in the future as time works with us. We are coming up on session, so that'll be kind of hard, but we're going to work on something. And I don't know what session looks like. I don't think anybody exactly knows what session looks like. With that said, Delegate Wells, do you want to say anything else?
No, only that thank you for all those who joined. Thank you to the panelists.
Yeah.
Great conversation, and I agree we should definitely have more, because there's just so much that we could talk about, and that we really do have to really make some significant strides on improving. So thank you to everyone, and I'm excited for our future.
Great. And again, thank you so much to everybody that took, an hour and a half, a little over an hour and a half tonight to be here with us, to help learn about the subject, to help educate us about the subject, and to help move Maryland forward in a way that is more just, in a way that is more clean, and in a way that is more clean economically and justly. So with that said, thank you everyone so very, very much, and buenas noches.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Y'all take care.